The German officers smiled when the American notice went up beside the camp gate. Not a nervous smile, a comfortable one. Because to them, it was only paper. No prisoner courts, no private punishment rolls, no officer control over food, mail, work details, or medical requests. No German rank used inside the wire without American approval. The interpreter read the last line aloud, and a German major near the front laughed like he had just heard a schoolboy threaten a general. He asked if the Americans truly believed one notice could make German soldiers stop obeying German officers. Behind him, several men laughed too. Then the laugh broke. A thin enlisted prisoner stepped out of the rear line, bent down, and pulled a black account book from inside his boot. He did not explain it, he threw it. The major moved first. An American MP moved faster. The book skidded across the dirt, the officer lunged, and the MP pinned it under his boot before any German hand could reach it. The interpreter opened the cover. Inside were names, not ranks, names. Men marked as obedient, men marked as weak, men marked as sick, men marked as willing to talk, men marked as needing letters badly enough to be controlled. Beside some names were ration marks, beside others were medicine marks, and beside 3 names, one word had been written in German: silence. The order had not changed the camp yet. It had only named what the officers had been hiding, and that was enough to make one hungry man stop being afraid. The major shouted that the book was a harmless internal record, but another prisoner was already running. 2 MPs chased him across the yard, past the wash hut, into Barrack 4, and through a door that had been nailed shut from the inside. They found him kneeling beside a loose floorboard. Under it sat a crate marked with Red Cross paint, wrapped in canvas and buried beneath spare straw. Inside were coffee packets, tins of meat, cigarettes, bandages, fever tablets, and unopened letters. Letters with names on them. Letters that had crossed an ocean and then stopped 8 feet under a German officer's bunk. The major said the goods were being stored for fair distribution. The thin prisoner finally found his voice. He said, sick men had been made to promise obedience before they could receive medicine that already belonged to them. He said hungry men had traded statements for bread. Men with family letters had been warned not to speak to American guards. Men who refused were written down and made invisible. The yard split in 2. German officers stood rigid near the gate. Enlisted prisoners watched from the barracks steps, afraid to look too relieved. The American duty sergeant ordered the crate carried into the open. It was placed directly below the notice. The paper the officers had mocked now hung over the first evidence table. A second German officer tried to tear it from the board while every eye was on the crate. An MP caught his wrist. A folded card slipped from the officer's sleeve and fell into the mud. On it was the same system: names, categories, punishment marks. Notes beside the men who had spoken to Americans. The commandant arrived from the office building and tried to move the inquiry indoors. The duty sergeant refused. If the officers had laughed in public, the proof would be read in public. Every German officer was separated from the enlisted line. The major was placed under guard beneath the notice he had called a joke, and the search began before the first crate had even been counted. The officers' barracks came apart board by board. Mattresses were pulled open. Boots were turned upside down. Shaving kits were emptied. Stovepipes were tapped. Bunk frames were lifted from the floor. Inside one frame, an MP found a folded camp diagram. Not an escape map. Something worse for the men standing in the yard. It showed the kitchen, the infirmary, the mail desk, the laundry shed, and the parcel room. Every arrow led back to Barrack 4. The officers had built a second camp inside the first one. The kitchen was searched next. Behind a stack of potato sacks sat a metal cash box full of ration cards stamped as issued. The cook said the cards had been completed. An enlisted prisoner raised his hand and said his own name was on 2 of them. He had not eaten a full ration in 3 days. The infirmary produced the next proof. Empty medicine envelopes were filed as delivered, but the medicine itself had been found under the floorboards. A medic held up one paper packet with an American pencil mark still visible. The name on it belonged to a feverish prisoner standing barefoot near the wash hut because his boots had been taken for punishment. The medicine had been counted as mercy, then sold back as obedience. Every time a prisoner spoke, the German major interrupted. Every time he interrupted, the interpreter wrote it down. That made him angrier than the search, because the power he still tried to use was becoming evidence against him. A laundry prisoner led 2 MPs to a drying room where coats hung from wire hooks. The linings had been cut, resewn, and pressed flat. Inside one coat were 7 sealed letters. Inside another were petitions written by prisoners, asking for American protection from German officer discipline. The mail clerk was brought forward. He admitted. The officer representatives had been allowed to help sort mail because they knew German names better than the Americans did. Then he admitted the officers had sometimes removed letters when they claimed the recipient was unstable, disloyal, or a discipline problem. One sealed envelope was opened in front of witnesses. A prisoner named Vogel heard his own name and stepped forward stiffly, as if stepping too quickly might cost him the paper. The letter said his wife and daughter had survived the fighting and were in an American-held town. For 1 second, his whole face changed. He smiled. Then he remembered who was watching and forced the smile down. That moment changed the yard more than the ration cards had. Hunger was one weapon, medicine was another. But family was the chain the officers had trusted most. The evidence was placed in 4 rows below the notice. Food, medicine, mail, punishment records. The rows matched the hidden book. By late afternoon, a runner came in from the farm detail with 2 prisoners who had refused to return. They had hidden in a tool shed with a ration card and a note warning them not to speak until the Americans forgot the new order. The sergeant read the note, folded it once, and laid it beside the black account book. The joke had lasted less than 1 hour. The government inside the wire had taken all day to surface. At dawn, the old privileges were cut away. No separate coffee for officers, no private writing hour, no closed officer meetings. No German representative would handle mail, parcels, food, or medical requests until Americans could prove he had been chosen freely. The German major refused to stand in the ordinary ration line. He remained beside the barracks steps with 6 officers behind him, arms folded, boots polished, faces hard. The duty sergeant gave no speech. He simply ordered the food line to move without them. The first men through the line were not officers. They were sick men. Then men from the night work detail. Then prisoners whose names had been marked unreliable in the black book. For months, some of them had eaten last. That morning, they received full rations directly from American hands. One prisoner received fever tablets before any officer could stop him. Vogel received 2 letters that had been withheld since winter, and every time an enlisted man received something directly, the old system lost one of its tools. The major understood it before some of the Americans did. He was not losing comfort, he was losing access. Access was the throne. A German captain tried to rebuild it before noon. Men began drifting toward the washroom in pairs, heads low, hands buried in sleeves. The MPs moved in fast. Inside the iron stove, wrapped in cloth, they found a list of men who had accepted direct rations that morning. The captain said it was only an attendance count. The interpreter read the title aloud, Men Without Honor. 3 prisoners who had received letters were immediately placed under American protection. The sergeant ordered a public face count using the official camp roster, not the German officer lists. Men who had been called silent stood in the open. Men who had been marked weak answered for themselves. Men who had been counted as sick stepped forward and were sent to the infirmary instead of back to the barracks. The hidden categories began to collapse because they no longer controlled the line. The consequence reached the American staff too. A supply clerk admitted he had trusted the German officers because their reports were neat. Their columns were clean. Their spelling was precise. Their requests looked disciplined. The black book showed what those clean columns had buried. The commandant removed the clerk from distribution duty. From that hour forward, American guards handled food. American clerks handled mail. American medics handled medical requests. No prisoner rank would decide who deserved a letter, a pill, a blanket, or a bowl. By afternoon, the officer storage shelves had been emptied in front of the entire camp. Extra blankets, soap, tobacco tins, unopened parcels, coffee packets, bandage rolls, writing paper, All the things the enlisted men had been told were scarce. The major watched the pile grow and said nothing, because scarcity had been his language, and now the vocabulary was lying in the dirt. The reversal came before anyone expected it. The Americans thought removing the officer system might create chaos. It did the opposite. The next morning, the ration line formed before the whistle. No pushing, no shouting, no officer barking orders. The sick were carried first. The laundry crew returned coats to the men named on the tags. 2 prisoners helped the medic copy medical requests onto clean American forms. The commandant asked who had organized it. An older German sergeant, gray-faced and limping, stepped forward. No one had, he said. The men simply remembered what fair looked like. That answer bothered the major more than any accusation, because it proved the camp had not needed his order. It had needed his hands removed from the supplies. The cook then opened a panel behind the bread oven and revealed 2 canvas sacks he had hidden the night the notice arrived. He said he had heard the officers plan to move the parcels before the search. Inside the sacks were ration cards, medicine labels, and a notebook unlike the first one. This notebook did not mark who could be punished. It marked who needed help. Fever, bad boots, no mail since January. Saved half ration for sick bunkmate. Knows English. Can identify officer signatures. The thin prisoner who had thrown the first book was listed there. So was the cook. The German major tried to call it a rival faction. The sergeant placed the 2 notebooks side by side. One book used weakness to control men. The other used weakness to protect them. Even prisoners who could not read understood the difference. The strongest reversal came from the infirmary. The barefoot fever patient identified an officer's signature on a denied treatment request. That same officer had told the Americans no medicine was available. The crate under the floor proved the medicine had existed when he refused it. The commandant ordered the officer brought forward and made him stand beside the crate while the medic read the request aloud. No one shouted. They did not need to. The paper, the medicine, and the officer's face did the work. Then the thin prisoner removed one final list from inside the stitched edge of his cap. He had carried it for weeks. Names of men willing to testify if the Americans ever broke officer control. He said they had been waiting for one sign that speaking would not cost them food. One by one, those men were called forward. They were placed under guard protection, not as rebels, as witnesses. By sunset, a new prisoner committee had been formed under American supervision, with elected men from each barracks instead of ranks. Their first job was not discipline. It was repair. Return every withheld letter. Record every sick man. Match every parcel to the name on the label. Rebuild the camp from the bottom up. The German major no longer looked like the defender of order. He looked like the reason order had been false. Night brought the final attempt. An MP near the laundry shed heard something tapping inside a wooden chute. He pulled out a soap tin tied with thread. Inside was a note ordering loyal officers to destroy the blue register before American review. The barracks lights came on. Guards entered the officer quarters with lanterns. 2 men were caught lifting a floorboard beneath a bunk. Under it was the blue register wrapped in oilcloth. Beside it lay ration stamps, privilege slips, and a pencil chart of American Guard routines. The blue register was worse than the black book. It did not only track food, it tracked pressure. Who had children? Who was sick? Who feared being called a traitor? Who needed news from home? Who could be turned against another prisoner? Who would sign a false complaint if his letters disappeared long enough? The commandant ordered the register read into the record under floodlights. The major stood at the gate below the notice while the men he had controlled heard their own fears spoken aloud by American authority. A prisoner named in the register as easy to pressure stepped forward with a recovered letter in his hand. He said he had signed complaints against 2 innocent men because an officer told him his family mail would stop if he refused. The clerk attached the letter to the page that named him. The major claimed the register had been necessary to prevent disorder. The sergeant did not argue. He rearranged the evidence table in front of him. Stolen parcels, hidden medicine, withheld letters, punishment rolls, false complaints, the black book, the blue register. The pattern no longer needed a witness. Before dawn, the commandant signed the final enforcement order. All German officer control over rations, mail, medicine, work assignments, complaints, and barracks discipline was permanently abolished. Any attempt to rebuild the shadow system would mean isolation and formal investigation. The major and his closest officers were moved to separate guarded quarters. They kept their legal status as prisoners. They lost the throne they had built from hunger, silence, and mail. The first roll call under the new system began as the sun rose. Names were read from an American roster. Letters were handed out by American guards. Medicine requests went straight to medics. Food parcels were opened in public and matched to their labels. The thin prisoner who threw the first book was called to the office. He expected interrogation. Instead, he was asked to help reconstruct the stolen mail records. He sat beside American clerks, matching handwriting to names, while the officer group watched from behind a fence. The original notice was taken down from the gate that afternoon, not because it had failed, because it had become permanent. A new board replaced it under glass, written in English and German, signed by the commandant, dated and posted where every man entering the yard would see it. No private prisoner courts, no officer control over necessities, no punishment outside American authority, no hidden lists. The German officers had laughed when the paper went up. By the next morning, they were living under the system it created, and the men who had been hungry, watched, and silenced walked to the ration table without asking permission from the people who once owned every line. The camp did not fall apart when the officers lost power. It started working the first morning. They could no longer sell fear as order.